Sometimes the most painful gift you receive at Christmas is the truth. I learned that lesson on a snowy Christmas Eve at the age of 71. The house was glowing with warm lights. A 12-foot Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, covered in ornaments collected over 4 decades. The dining table was filled with food: roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, fresh dinner rolls, pumpkin pie. Everything looked exactly the way a family Christmas was supposed to look. My son Michael sat beside his wife Sarah. My granddaughter Emma was scrolling through her phone between bites of dinner. Laughter filled the room. At least it did for a while. Earlier that afternoon, I had planned to share something important. After years of hard work and careful saving, I had decided to make a major announcement about my future. I had spent months thinking about it. I believed it would help bring the family closer together. I even carried the documents in a folder inside my briefcase. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had spoken first. But life rarely follows the script we imagine. The conversation shifted when Michael started talking about future plans. He spoke confidently about renovations to his house, vacation ideas, and projects he wanted to start next year. At first I listened quietly. Then I noticed something strange. Every plan seemed to include assumptions. Assumptions about resources. Assumptions about support. Assumptions about things nobody had actually discussed with me. I try not to think too much about it. After all, it was Christmas. Then Sarah made a joke about how the family would always stay connected because everything would eventually remain within the family. Everyone laughed except me. Something about the way she said it felt different. Before I could respond, Michael leaned back in his chair and smiled. That is because we already know how things work. I asked him what he meant. The room became quieter. He took a sip of his drink and shrugged. Come on, Dad. Let us be honest. I felt an uncomfortable knot form in my stomach. Honest about what? I asked. Michael looked around the table as though expecting agreement. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. You are not real family anymore. For a second I honestly thought I had misheard him. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody corrected him. The Christmas music playing softly in the background suddenly seemed very far away. I stared at my son. What does that mean? I asked calmly. Michael shrugged again. You live alone. You do your own thing. You are basically separate from us now. We are our own family. The words themselves hurt, but not as much as what happened next. Nothing. Sarah looked down at her plate. Emma avoided eye contact. Nobody said he was wrong. Nobody defended me. Nobody even looked surprised. I sat there quietly while years of memories moved through my mind. Birthday parties, school events, college tuition payments, helping with down payments, emergency loans, weekend projects, countless moments I never kept score of because that is what family does. Yet somehow I was now sitting at my own Christmas table feeling like a guest. I forced a small smile and changed the subject. Dinner continued. Conversations resumed. The evening moved forward. To everyone else it probably looked like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something important. Because while the rest of the family enjoyed dessert and exchanged gifts, I found myself paying attention to details I had ignored for years. Who called me and when? Who reached out only when they needed something? Who seemed interested in me as a person and who seemed interested only in what I provided? By the time the evening ended, I had not raised my voice once. I had not argued. I had not left the table. But I had made a decision. And the folder inside my briefcase was about to become far more important than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. After everyone left that night, I sat alone in the living room long after the Christmas lights had dimmed. Snow continued falling outside the windows, covering the neighborhood in a quiet blanket of white. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because I could not stop hearing Michael's words. You are not real family anymore. I replayed the moment over and over. The sentence itself hurt, but what stayed with me most was the silence that followed. Nobody challenged him. Nobody looked shocked. Nobody said he was wrong. It was as if everyone at that table had already accepted the idea long before I heard it spoken aloud. Around midnight, I opened the folder inside my briefcase. Earlier that year, I had met with financial advisors and legal professionals to organize my future. At 71, I wanted things to be simple, responsible, fair. The documents outlined plans I intended to share with my family that evening. Plans that included significant support for Michael and his household. Plans designed to make life easier for everyone after I was gone. I stared at the papers for several minutes before placing them back inside the folder. For the first time, I wondered whether anyone actually valued me or simply valued what I provided. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. My phone contained several messages from family members. Every single one discussed gifts, schedules, travel plans, or expenses. Not one asked how I was feeling. Not one mentioned the conversation from the night before. It was as though the entire incident had been erased from everyone else's memory. I decided to spend the day reviewing old messages. At first, I told myself I was being emotional. I expected to prove myself wrong. Instead, I discovered something unsettling. The pattern stretched back years. Michael often called when he needed advice about money. He called when a bill appeared unexpectedly. He called when a project exceeded budget. He called when something needed fixing. Yet long stretches existed where there were no calls at all. No check-ins. No casual conversations. No invitations without a purpose attached. By afternoon, I had gone through nearly 3 years of messages. The more I reviewed them, the harder it became to ignore what I was seeing. Most conversations began with a request, a favor, a need, an obligation. I found myself asking a question I never wanted to ask. If I stopped providing help tomorrow, how much of this relationship would remain? 2 days later, Michael called. His voice sounded cheerful. "Hey Dad, hope you had a good Christmas." I waited. Sure enough, less than 2 minutes later, the reason for the call arrived. He wanted to discuss financing for a renovation project. I listened quietly. When he finished explaining his plans, I asked a simple question. "Michael, do you remember what you said to me at dinner?" There was a brief pause. "What do you mean?" "You told me I was not real family anymore." Silence filled the line. Then he laughed lightly. "Dad, come on. That was not a big deal. You were taking it too seriously." I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation shortly afterward. But his response revealed something important. He did not regret what he said. In fact, he barely remembered saying. Over the next week, I stopped looking at the situation through the eyes of a father and started looking at it through the eyes of an observer. The difference was uncomfortable. Fathers tend to explain things away. They make excuses. They focus on intentions rather than patterns. Observers focus on facts. And the facts were becoming difficult to ignore. I began keeping notes. Not because I wanted evidence against anyone, but because I wanted clarity. Every phone call, every visit, every request, every conversation. It did not take long before a pattern emerged that was impossible to miss. Michael called 3 times that week. The first time was about a contractor. The second was about property taxes. The third was about financing for a new vehicle. During none of those conversations did he ask how I was doing. He never mentioned Christmas. He never asked whether his words had hurt me. It was as if that entire evening had never happened. One afternoon, I met an old friend for lunch. His name was Walter. We had known each other for more than 30 years. At one point, he asked how my holiday had gone. I hesitated before answering. Then I told him the truth. Walter listened quietly. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something that stayed with me. "Richard, people rarely reveal themselves all at once. Usually they do it one small piece at a time until one day you finally decide to see it." On the drive home, I thought about that sentence. Maybe Christmas had not changed anything. Maybe it had simply exposed what had already been there. That evening, I opened an old storage box in my study. Inside were years of family records, greeting cards, photographs, and handwritten notes. I spent hours going through them. At first, it felt nostalgic. Then it became revealing. I noticed that many of the thank you notes I had saved were connected to financial help. College expenses, home repairs, medical bills, emergency situations. There was nothing wrong with helping family. I would do it again without hesitation. But I struggled to find evidence of the relationship existing independently of those moments. The realization left me unsettled. 2 days later, I received an email from Michael. The subject line immediately caught my attention. It concerned future planning. Attached was a detailed outline of projects he hoped to complete over the next several years. As I read through it, one detail appeared again and again. Assumptions, future support, future contributions, future resources, my resources. Yet nowhere in the document was there a single question asking what I wanted for my own future. I closed the email and stared out the window for a long time. Snow still covered the yard. The Christmas decorations remained outside, but they suddenly felt hollow. Then I remembered the folder in my desk, the one containing plans I had originally prepared for my family. Plans nobody knew about yet. I opened it again and reviewed every page. The more I read, the more I realized something important. For years, I had been making decisions based on obligations I assumed would always exist. But obligations depend on relationships, and relationships require mutual respect. A few days later, I received a group message from Michael discussing a family vacation for the following summer. Destinations were being discussed. Budgets were being estimated. Expectations were already forming. Reading through the conversation, I noticed something strange. My participation seemed to be assumed. Not requested. Assumed. For the first time, instead of responding immediately, I put my phone down and walked away. Because a question had started forming in my mind. If I truly was no longer considered family, why was I still expected to carry responsibilities reserved for family? And the more I thought about that question, the more I realized the answer was about to change everything. The question stayed with me for days. If I was no longer considered family, why was I still expected to carry responsibilities that belonged to family? The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable the answer became. One cold January morning, I decided to stop guessing and start looking at reality. I reviewed every financial commitment I had made over the previous 5 years. Some were large, some were small. Monthly assistance, unexpected repairs, contributions toward vacations, help with school expenses, insurance support, gifts that gradually became expectations. As I studied the numbers, I realized something surprising. None of it had ever bothered me before. I had never viewed those things as burdens. I viewed them as acts of love. But love changes when gratitude disappears. Later that week, I received another call from Michael. This time he sounded frustrated. A contractor had increased the projected cost of a renovation. He spent nearly 20 minutes discussing budgets and timelines. I listened quietly. Then he asked a question that made me stop writing notes. Do you think you can help cover part of the difference? For several seconds, I said nothing. Not because I was angry, because I genuinely wanted to understand something. Michael, I asked calmly, when was the last time you called just to talk? Silence filled the line. What do you mean? He replied. I mean exactly what I said. More silence followed. Eventually, he laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. That reaction told me more than any answer could have. Over the next several weeks, similar moments kept happening. Messages arrived discussing expenses. Requests appeared regarding future plans. Assumptions continued to be made. Yet nobody seemed interested in discussing the Christmas dinner that had changed everything. It was as if everyone expected me to forget. One afternoon, I accidentally discovered something that explained a great deal. While reviewing a shared family email chain about the summer vacation, I noticed an attachment that had been forwarded by mistake. It contained planning notes, estimated contributions, expected expenses, room assignments, activity budgets. My name appeared several times throughout the document. Not once as a participant, not once as a guest. My name appeared only beside projected financial contributions. I read the document twice to make sure I understood correctly. Then I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a long time. The realization was not dramatic. It was not shocking anymore. It was simply clear. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being seen as a person and started being seen as a resource. That evening, I took a long walk through the neighborhood. The air was cold. The streets were quiet. Christmas decorations were beginning to disappear from front yards. As I passed familiar homes, I thought about the photo. The meeting with David Turner took place on a gray Thursday morning. Snow still covered the sidewalks outside his office, and the cold air followed me in as I stepped through the door. David greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room where a thick folder already sat waiting on the table. The same folder we had worked on months earlier. At that time, I had arrived full of plans for my family's future. This time, I arrived with questions. David noticed the difference immediately. You seem more certain than the last time we met, he said. I nodded. I am. He opened the file and began reviewing the documents we had prepared. Trusts, beneficiary designations, long-term plans, support arrangements. Everything had been designed around assumptions I once believed were permanent. David listened carefully as I explained what had happened over Christmas and everything I had discovered afterward. When I finished, he remained silent for several moments. Then he asked a simple question. Richard, what outcome are you looking for? I thought about that carefully. I am not trying to punish anyone, I said. I just do not want to keep pretending everything is normal when it clearly is not. David nodded slowly. That is a very different goal. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing every part of the plan. For the first time, I looked at those documents through a different lens. Not as obligations, not as expectations, as choices. The realization felt strangely liberating. By the time the meeting ended, several major revisions had been made. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just thoughtful decisions based on present reality rather than old assumptions. As I left the office, I felt lighter than I had in months. The following week, something interesting happened. Michael called again. This time he sounded excited. He told me the renovation project was moving forward and that he expected construction to begin by early spring. I listened patiently. Then he mentioned budget concerns and asked whether I would still be helping with the final phase of financing. The question arrived so naturally that it almost sounded routine, as if the answer had already been decided. I took a deep breath. No, I said calmly. Silence filled the line. What do you mean no? He asked. I mean I will not be participating financially. Another pause followed. Did something happen? I almost laughed at the question. Something had happened. It happened at Christmas dinner. It happened in countless conversations before that. It happened every time respect was replaced by expectation. But instead of saying any of that, I simply replied, I have decided to make different plans for my future. Michael sounded confused. I thought we already had plans. There it was again. We. Yet somehow I was not considered family. The contradiction would have been amusing if it had not been so revealing. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in my study. For the first time, I noticed that I did not feel guilty. I had expected guilt. Fathers are conditioned to feel it whenever they say no. Instead, I felt clarity. Over the next several days, more conversations followed. Sarah sent a polite message asking if everything was all right. Michael called twice more. Even Emma reached out to ask whether I would still be attending the summer trip. Their sudden interest was impossible to ignore. For months, my thoughts and feelings had barely seemed relevant. Now every decision I made attracted attention. That alone told me something important. The changes were being noticed. And somewhere within those reactions, I sensed that people were beginning to realize the assumptions they had. When I opened the front door and saw Michael standing on my porch, I immediately knew this visit was different. He was not smiling. He was not carrying coffee like he sometimes did. He was not there for a casual conversation. He stepped inside, removed his coat, and sat down at the kitchen table without waiting for an invitation. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he looked directly at me and asked, "What is going on?" I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. "What do you mean?" I asked. Michael shook his head. "You know exactly what I mean. You have been acting differently ever since Christmas." The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh. Acting differently. As if Christmas had happened in a vacuum. As if words carried no consequences. I stirred my coffee slowly. Maybe I am simply paying more attention. Michael frowned. To what? I looked at him carefully before answering. To reality. The room grew quiet. Outside, a light snow was beginning to fall again. Michael leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Dad, if this is about that comment at dinner, you are blowing it way out of proportion." There it was again. Not an apology. Not regret. Just dismissal. I had heard that tone before. The tone people use when they believe their words should not have consequences. "Do you remember exactly what you said?" I asked. "More or less." Then repeat it. Michael hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. "I do not see the point. Humor me." He looked away before finally speaking. "I said you were not really part of the family anymore." Hearing this sentence again felt different this time. Less painful. More revealing. "And did you mean it?" I asked. Michael sighed heavily. "Not literally." "Then what did you mean?" He struggled for an answer. "I meant that things are different now. You live alone. We have our own household. Our own priorities." I nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Michael seemed relieved by my response. Then I continued. "What does not make sense is expecting family-level obligations from someone you no longer consider family." His expression changed immediately. "What is that supposed to mean?" I leaned forward slightly. "It means I listened very carefully to what you said. Then I adjusted my decisions accordingly." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Michael stared at me as though he was hearing a language he did not understand. "You were talking about the renovation project. Among other things." "Dad, that is completely different." "Is it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could almost see him trying to connect 2 ideas that had never needed to coexist before. Respect and expectation, relationship and responsibility. For years, support had been automatic. Nobody questioned it. Nobody examined it. It simply existed. Now, for the first time, it did not. Michael, I said calmly, I spent weeks asking myself whether I was being unfair. Then I realized something. If our relationship matters only when assistance is available, then we have a much bigger problem than money. He looked genuinely frustrated now. That is not what this is about. Then tell me what it is about. He had no immediate answer. Instead, he looked around the kitchen, avoiding eye contact. Finally, he spoke more quietly. I just never thought things would change. I nodded. Neither did I. For several moments we sat in silence. Then Michael stood and walked toward the window. Snowflakes drifted across the backyard. Sarah is worried, he said. About what? About everything. I considered that carefully. Because for the first time since Christmas, I sensed something new beneath the frustration. Concern. Uncertainty. Consequences becoming real. As Michael prepared to leave, he paused at the front door and turned toward me. So what happens now? He asked. I looked at him and realized the answer would determine everything that came next. That depends, I said quietly, on whether you want a relationship with me or a relationship with what I can provide. After Michael left, I stood at the front door for a long time watching the snow fall across the driveway. His question lingered in my mind. So what happens now? The truth was that I had spent weeks thinking about that very thing. Not because I wanted distance from my family, but because I wanted honesty. For too long, everyone had been operating on assumptions. I had assumed my efforts were appreciated. Michael had assumed my support would always be available. Somewhere between those assumptions, the relationship itself had been neglected. Over the following days, the atmosphere changed. The phone calls became more frequent. Sarah reached out twice asking if we could all sit down together. Emma sent a short message asking if I would still attend her spring school event. None of those conversations mentioned money directly, yet the timing was impossible to ignore. For the first time, people seemed concerned about maintaining contact. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah stopped by unexpectedly. She arrived carrying a container of homemade cookies and an expression that looked equal parts nervous and exhausted. I invited her inside. After a few minutes of small talk, she finally addressed the situation. Michael has been stressed, she said quietly. I nodded. I imagine he has. Sarah looked down at her hands. Everything feels uncertain right now. I considered her words carefully. Uncertain for whom? She seemed surprised by the question. For all of us. I leaned back in my chair. Sarah, uncertainty is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it forces people to examine things they have taken for granted. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the cup of tea sitting in front of her. I do not think anyone meant to hurt you, she finally said. I believed her. That was the complicated part. Intentions and consequences are rarely the same thing. I know that, I replied. But good intentions do not erase the impact of what happened. Sarah nodded slowly. Before leaving, she paused near the front door. I think Michael is beginning to understand that. After she left, I spent the rest of the evening thinking about those words. Beginning to understand. Understanding often arrives long after damage has already been done. The following week brought another surprise. Michael called and asked if we could meet for lunch. Not to discuss projects. Not to discuss budgets. Just lunch. It was the first invitation of its kind in years. We met at a small diner we used to visit when he was younger. For the first few minutes, conversation remained cautious. Weather, sports, local news. Then eventually the silence neither of us could avoid settled between us. Dad, he said, staring at his coffee. I have been thinking about what you asked me. I waited. About whether I wanted a relationship with you or a relationship with what you could provide. He took a deep breath. I did not like the answer I came up with. That was the first truly honest thing I had heard since Christmas. I looked at my son and saw something different. Not anger. Not entitlement. Discomfort. The kind that appears when someone starts confronting truths they have spent years avoiding. What answer did you come up with? I asked. Michael rubbed his forehead. I think somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing everything you were doing because I assumed it would always be there. The diner suddenly felt very quiet. I did not interrupt. And when you stopped helping, he continued, I realized how much of my planning depended on you. More than I wanted to admit. For the first time, we were not talking about money. We were talking about responsibility, accountability, reality. As we finished lunch, Neither of us pretended everything was fixed. Some wounds require time. Some conversations require repetition. But for the first time since Christmas, I felt something I had not felt in months. Progress. And as we walked out into the cold afternoon air, Michael stopped beside his truck and said something that made me realize the story was far from over. "There is something else you need to know," he said. "Something Sarah and I should have told you a long time ago." Michael's words stayed with me all the way home. "There is something else you need to know. Something Sarah and I should have told you a long time ago." For the next 2 days, I found myself wondering what could possibly be important enough to carry that kind of weight. I had already uncovered the assumptions. I had already seen how dependent everyone had become on support they no longer appreciated. What else could there be? The answer arrived on Sunday afternoon when Michael and Sarah came to my house together. The atmosphere felt different from any conversation we had shared in months. There was no discussion about renovations, no mention of vacations, no requests. They sat across from me in the living room and exchanged nervous glances before Sarah finally spoke. "We were embarrassed," she said quietly. "And then the longer we waited, the harder it became to tell you." I remained silent. Sarah took a deep breath. "About 3 years ago, when things started improving financially, Michael and I began making decisions based on expectations instead of realities." Michael nodded. "We assumed certain things would always be available. None of this surprised me." "Go on," I said. Michael looked down at his hands. "The house upgrade, the renovation plans, the vacation budget, even some investment decisions. We built all of it around the belief that your support would always be there if something went wrong." The room became very quiet. Not because the admission shocked me, because hearing it spoken aloud removed every remaining layer of uncertainty. "Did you ever discuss those assumptions with me?" I asked. Michael shook his head. "No, why not?" He answered honestly. "Because we thought we already knew the answer." For the first time, I could see genuine regret on his face. Not regret over losing financial help. Regret over realizing how casually he had treated something that should never have been taken for granted. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "The truth is that we stopped seeing your support as generosity. We started seeing it as part of the plan." That sentence landed harder than anything else, because it perfectly explained what had been bothering me since Christmas. Gifts had quietly become obligations. Appreciation had become expectation. Somewhere along the way, gratitude had disappeared. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had begun melting. Small patches of green grass were finally appearing beneath the winter landscape. "Do you know what hurt most?" I asked without turning around. Neither of them answered. It was not the money. It was not the assumptions. It was hearing my own son tell me I was not really family, while still expecting me to carry family responsibilities. The silence behind me felt heavy. Eventually, Michael spoke. "You are right." Those 3 words were simple, but they were also the first full acceptance of responsibility I had heard since this began. No excuses, no explanations, no attempts to minimize what happened. Just acceptance. We spent the next hour talking honestly. More honestly than we had spoken in years. I learned things I had never known. The pressure Michael felt to maintain appearances. The financial mistakes he was afraid to admit. The pride that prevented him from asking for advice. The fear of looking dependent. Ironically, those fears had pushed him into becoming even more dependent. By the time the conversation ended, nothing had magically been fixed. But something important had happened. The truth was finally sitting in the room with us. Before leaving, Michael stopped near the front door. "Dad," he said quietly, "I know I cannot undo what happened, but I want to earn back your trust." I studied his face for a moment. Then I nodded. "Trust is not rebuilt through promises." He swallowed hard. "How is it rebuilt?" I opened the door and looked directly at him. "Through actions. Consistent actions. Over time." Michael nodded slowly. And as I watched him and Sarah walk down the driveway together, I realized that the real payback had never been about taking something away. It was about forcing everyone to finally see the truth they had spent years avoiding. The months that followed were not dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no miraculous transformations. Real change rarely happens that way. Instead, it arrived through small decisions repeated consistently over time. Spring slowly replaced winter. The snow disappeared. Trees began turning green again. Life moved forward. And for the first time in years, our family started building relationships that were not centered around expectations. Michael called more often. Sometimes the conversations lasted only a few minutes. Sometimes they lasted an hour. What mattered was that they were no longer attached to requests. We talked about baseball, neighborhood news, old family memories, ordinary things, the kind of conversations that should have existed all along. Sarah also changed. She stopped treating communication like an obligation. She began inviting me to family dinners simply because she wanted me there, not because something needed to be discussed, not because a decision needed approval, just because I was family. Even Emma noticed the difference. One afternoon, she invited me to attend a school presentation. As I sat in the audience watching her speak confidently in front of a crowded room, I realized how many moments I might have missed if things had continued the way they were. Afterward, she ran over and hugged me. "I am glad you came, Grandpa." Such a simple sentence. Yet it carried more meaning than she probably realized. During that same period, I continued following through with the decisions I had made earlier in the year. The revised plans remained in place. The changes David and I had made were not reversed. That surprised Michael at first. One evening, he asked me directly whether things would ever go back to the way they were before. I answered honestly, no. He looked disappointed for a moment. Then I continued, because the old version was not working. He nodded slowly. I think he understood. The old version had been built on assumptions. The new version was being built on respect. There is a significant difference between the two. By the time summer arrived, our family felt healthier than it had in a very long time. Not perfect. No family is perfect, but healthier. The tension that once sat beneath every conversation had faded. More importantly, honesty had taken its place. One evening in July, we gathered for dinner in Michael's backyard. The sun was setting. Emma was laughing with friends. Sarah carried plates of food to the picnic table. Michael stood beside the grill talking about a project he had completed entirely on his own. As I watched him, I felt something I had not felt since before Christmas. Pride. Not because he succeeded financially, because he had accepted responsibility. That mattered far more. At one point during dinner, the conversation drifted toward holiday plans for the end of the year. Everyone began sharing ideas. Then Michael suddenly looked at me. "Dad," he said, "I owe you something." The table became quiet. I smiled slightly. "What is that?" He took a deep breath. "An apology. A real one." Nobody spoke. "What I said that night was wrong," he continued. And what made it worse was how long it took me to understand why it was wrong. For a moment, nobody moved. Then I simply nodded. I did not need a dramatic scene. I did not need revenge. I did not need anyone to suffer. Because the real lesson had already been learned. People value things differently when they realize those things are not guaranteed. As the evening continued, I looked around the table and thought back to that Christmas dinner. Back then, I felt like an outsider sitting among strangers. Now, months later, I saw something completely different. Not because anyone had given me money, favors, or promises. Because they had finally given me something far more valuable. Respect. And as the sun disappeared below the horizon and laughter filled the backyard once more, I realized the greatest payback was never taking something away. It was reminding everyone what truly mattered before it was too late.